Hello and welcome to the Drexel interview. I'm your host, Paula Marantz Cohen, speaking to you from the Peck Alumni Center at Drexel University. This is the second part of a two-part interview. My guests are cultural critic Camille Paglia and legal scholar Laura Beth Nielsen. Dr. Paglia is professor of humanities and media studies at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, and Dr. Nielsen is a research professor at the American Bar Association and a director of legal studies at Northwestern University. I'm pleased to have them here following a conference held at Drexel University entitled Free Speech on the College Campus. Camille Paglia and Laura Beth Nielsen were our keynote speakers. During this second part interview, we are going to continue to revisit some of the ideas touched on in their talks and address this vexed subject as comprehensively as we can. Camille Paglia, Laura Beth Nielsen, welcome to the Drexel interview.
Thank you.
Title IX is one of the areas where there's been a tremendous accumulation of discord. It was originally developed to allow women to have equal access to sports on the college campus, equal support for their sports as for men's sports. But it's been expanded now to include issues relating to sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, particularly with regard to women. Do you agree, and do you think it's been overstretched?
Well, I got involved in the sports part of this when the Princeton alumni contacted me about the abolition of the long-standing wrestling program there as an attempt to meet the requirements of Title IX. And what was happening nationwide was that in order to achieve this equity of investment in the two genders' athletic programs, that such sport, that all kinds of sports, including like wrestling, happened to have a great many inner city African Americans involved in it, and instead in its place was put like a women's water polo and things that actually were prep school kinds of sports. So the end result was actually actually prejudicial, to African Americans. But one of the problems in that originally was that the men's sports drew money, to the university. The programs, people bought tickets and to watch them, whereas most women's sports didn't have that kind of so there was always a kind of ham-handed. But I think it's great because in many cases, the women's athletes were forced. They didn't have locker rooms and didn't have the ability to hire buses to take them from city to city. So there were outstanding inequities that were resolved by Title IX. But what I think is the abuse, the current abuse of Title IX, is this intrusion into the private social lives of students. Here I must draw a line. I take a very extreme view, which is that the government has no business, trying to legislate about the relationships, the sexual relationships of men and women on campus. Again, if a crime is committed, then there should be a punishment and expulsion and everything else. But there's a whole hazy area here. I got notorious in the early 90s through my analysis of the date rape, controversy. My manifesto on this subject began, rape is an outrage that cannot be tolerated in civilized society. That's the first sentence, But then I went on to say, date rape, with this he said, she said thing, where women have consented to go to men's rooms and there's no evidence of injury, and she thinks about it, and 6 months later or next year makes a complaint. This seems to me, a police state kind of surveillance of students' private lives. So I believe that Title IX has really erred now, in forcing this issue, and also therefore absorbing the energy of all the educational institutions into complying with this pressure. So the energy, instead of going toward educational reform and making the multicultural kind of innovations that I think are necessary, to bring in African American, Native American subjects, so Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, all these things I think should be part of a central curriculum. Instead of that, we're with worrying about, again, the dating issue. So I think it's totalitarian. I think that the university should ask no questions of any kind about the social lives of its students.
Let's take it a step further and think about what it is about college, or perhaps the whole tension and anxiety that surrounds college nowadays, which is new, somewhat new, maybe not so new, that might be informing the binge drinking, which I do think is somewhat, I mean, there's always been some of that in frat parties and so forth, but now it's become, I think, epidemic on a level. I mean, I was in college and people drank, but a lot of people didn't drink. But now if you don't drink, you feel, there's nothing for you to do on the weekend in many schools. I'm not saying all. But I'm wondering about what it is about college itself and the anxiety that's produced around it, and perhaps what one is supposed to get from it and how well one is supposed to do and where one's supposed to go from there, as well as getting into college, which may produce this culture of anxiety that leads to drinking. Or do you think that's too grandiose a
Well, it's an
point?
Interesting connection between the late high school years and the college years. And I've got two sons, one first year in college and one who's a sophomore in high school. And so you're going through it, and it's incredibly competitive, and it's ramped up by U.S. News and World Report, and then colleges say we have to have really high rejection rates, so we'll give millions of people a free code so that the application numbers can be huge and the acceptance rate is low. And so you have these students who are getting rejection after rejection after rejection. They get a letter that says, oh, please come, we want you to apply, here's your free application code, and then they apply and they get rejected. I think it's the neoliberal university has a lot of problems. U.S. News and World Report is one of them, and it drives a lot of really unhealthy competition and sort of achievement without love of learning.
Yes.
I went to UC Santa Cruz. We had no grades. I tell this to my students on the first day. I say, I don't care about your grades. I cannot get worked up about it. I learned what I wanted to learn. And that's what we're not fostering, but it's harder and harder to turn the switch based on what's happened the 2 years leading up to them
But
going
it's
to
also
college.
connected to the job market on the other end.
Totally.
Yeah, there's a real toxic environment in this race for prestige. It's awful. Okay, colleges and universities today, absolutely. But in terms of the alcohol, there's been a tradition going back to the beginnings of the university, the Goliardic tradition. Okay, where the students would drink wine, women, and song, so on. I mean, so it's always been there. Okay?
Yeah.
It's a release from the tensions. I mean, any young people who are in a hierarchical environment, with expectations from above, okay, are going to want to have a Dionysian release. Right? The problem is the complete lack of sophistication now, okay, of social life. Okay, it is ridiculous how our young people in the U.S. are treated as children until they're 21, compared to the European model. Okay, in Europe, children are given a little bit of wine early on. Okay, so I've written a manifesto, okay, in Time magazine, against the age 21 rule. I believe it must be abolished. It must be rethought. And I think that's the focus. And a lot of all of these problems with date rape exploded after the age 21 law was passed.
So I know that in the past, the idea was that the university would cover up abuses in order to protect its reputation. Now it seems that the accusation is the opposite, that universities punish those accused of misdemeanors or perhaps even unjustly accused to protect themselves in advance from the possibility of any problem or litigation. And that is an interesting shift. And I wonder, as a lawyer, what you think of that, and that sea change, so to speak, that has happened.
I think there is a fascinating interaction between Title IX and the way it's being used today and the Clery Act. And it goes back to U.S. News and World Report.
What is the Clery Act?
The Clery Act requires universities to publish their crime data, that includes sexual assault, but also burglaries, murders, all kinds of things. And they publish it, every university publishes it every year. And so it goes back to college rankings, and the crime rate becomes one of the factors that goes into college ranking systems. And so the university has an enormous interest in resolving it somehow in an internal process so that, and it would be really cool if we didn't end up having to classify this as a violent sexual assault. Let's call this indecent behavior, and so the slippage between these categories and the fact that the determination of what has happened is happening in an internal process with due process protections, but not the same we see in a criminal court, because of course in a university system of punishment, the punishment is not that you go to jail. So in the legal system, we say we're going to deprive you of your liberty, you're going to have to go to jail, we're going to have to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, this isn't a court system, it's a university committee. And so it's a much lower standard of proof. It gives a lot of wiggle room for redefining things, and the university has a very vested interest in making sure that their Title IX complaints and their Clery Act data look good, because applications and even alumni donations are really tied to these rankings. And so we're in this process where all of these factors are working together to prevent us working toward a safe environment on campus.
See, and because of this, okay, the bureaucracy keeps expanding and expanding, more and more offices, more and more staff to handle all this. And there's a kind of mania, okay, that is coming from the administrators, okay, that's making the teaching profession extremely unpleasant, a very unpleasant environment. The faculty have lost control of the universities and the colleges. Okay, the educational mission is no longer the central thing. Instead, we are inundated, I am even at an art school, inundated with these dictates, okay, from the affirmative action office, from the administrators about every staff member must view the sexual harassment training video every year and so on. So it's a kind of an authoritarian environment, right? And the faculty, okay, which is not in any way qualified or experienced to cope with this new bureaucratic environment, is shrinking back, okay, into itself. Whereas it's completely different than when I started teaching in the 1970s. My first job was at Bennington College, and there was an uprising. We like rebelled against the trustees, we threw out the president. It was like Nora Ephron came up and covered it for Esquire magazine and so on, right? And I don't see anywhere, okay, the faculty have the heart, okay, to stand up and to say, the amount of bureaucracy here is part of this consumerist environment of selling the university is starting to strangle the educational mission, okay, so
what about this affirmative, affirmative consent codes now that's connected to this, where every step of a relationship, I mean, is this apocryphal, or is this actually true that in some schools students are supposed to get agreement from their partner for each stage of the process toward the consummation of a sexual act?
Yes, it's the law in California.
It's the law in California. And could you actually explain it to me? I mean, like, give me an example of how it would work.
So it requires active, ongoing affirmative consent as the process goes on. So the idea is that I might be consenting to make out with you, but not to have intercourse with you, or any step in between, right? So as you round the bases, as we used to say in high school, that there's some sort of communication that the next step is okay. And is it actually happening? I don't know. I'm about to embark on interviews where I try to talk to college students about how they're negotiating those sexual acts and how they track with what their college actually requires and whether or not they took the training and all of that stuff. I'm going to try to study that.
Is there a video about this that shows it? I mean, I would think that would be the first thing we need to.
Yeah? Yeah, when you were speaking yesterday, you were talking about this thing they have to go to every year. A lot of it is now online for the students as well, which is also not great because, those videos tend to emphasize illegality for things that aren't actually illegal, but that's sort of another point. But not doing it as part of a conversation, I think, it deprives the students. If you're going to make them do the education, they should have a chance to talk about it with each other and with a trained professor.
You mean as opposed to just having to watch the video and then sign that they've done it?
Yes, and you actually have to click through, right? It's like driver's ed, like when you get a ticket. So that's the yes means yes, is the idea is, that you are obtaining consent. All parties are required to obtain it for all parties engaged in a sexual act.
Yeah, I mean, it is so. When there isn't an agreement, then the person who had not agreed has the right to complain and sue or whatever.
Well, yes, then the person who did it has broken the law.
Has broken the law, or broken the law of the university,
which in California is required by the state law.
Okay.
But right, so and that's it's a big right. So there you have the government telling the state government, telling the universities what their standard has to be. And then that would be this whole internal process that we've talked about being troubling. I mean, rapists should be prosecuted. I really need to be clear about that. But if you think that should happen in an internal process at a university or by our court system, not to, valorize our legal system as dealing with this in some, progressive and enlightened way, but we have centuries of jurisprudence about habeas corpus and rules of evidence and burdens of proof that, are important if somebody's going to be actually put in jail. Right now, we have the same punishment. The worst punishment you can get for raping someone on campus, like violent rape of a student on student, is at a university, if we're not talking about the police, is the same punishment we give to a plagiarizer, right? So the worst thing that a university can do is expel you. And we're saying that rape is the same as plagiarism. Plagiarism is bad.
I still don't understand, because you're not going, for plagiarism, you're not going to go to the police. But you could go to the police for the rape, and then you would get a more stringent response.
Right? You might. You're equally likely to be
that,
dismissed, but you are invoking the machinery of the state and all that goes with it, the protections for the accused and the rights of the targeted person to participate in the case. And when it gets into the university system, we see a lot of abuse, we see a lot of mistakes, we see a lot of covering up. It's not open to be reviewed or analyzed, whereas court documents are public records and we can make study of them.
So you two agree on this point?
I do, but I will say, you dial 911 from any campus, the campus police tend to show up. You don't know if you dial 911 who is actually going to show up. But yes, I would tell my students, and I tell faculty when I teach about Title IX and the Clery Act, when I'm talking to faculty, your university cannot prevent you from going to the local police.
I guess, but getting back to the affirmative consent codes.
Right. Yes, means how does that work?
I find that an interesting conundrum, because romance and romantic relationship is like literature. It has a spontaneous element, and it is, beautiful. And if you chop it up, it's going to be something else. And so I can see your point that there would be room for abuse, but then the whole notion of stopping along the way. I'm playing devil's advocate here because I can see both sides, but I just can't see how. I think the whole nature of relationship, if students at a young age are schooled in this, the whole notion of relationship will change in a way that is mechanized and not pretty.
It doesn't mean that you have to obtain active, ongoing affirmative consent. It's not. It's not a contract that has to be pulled out and signed. It's that in your relationship, if you're in a relationship, if you're not in a relationship, that might be a good thing that each step is sort of cut up. It's a one-off sexual encounter, and we want to make sure that nobody's being harmed in it. But if you're in a relationship, consent can begin to, you don't want to say once given consent, always given consent, but you do begin to know what affirmative consent feels like in a committed sexual relationship. And I don't think those are the ones that there will be examples, but those don't tend to be the ones that are brought to campus authorities.
Well, I think that the yes means yes rule is just part of the latent Puritanism of American culture. I think it's like we can find it goes back to the Salem witch trials. I think it's completely unsophisticated. Why is it that we imagine that women are inherently frailer, and more vulnerable and more naive, that they need this kind of a system, imposed on them? So how I see it is that my generation of women sort of bulled through, broke down all the old rules and conventions and protections that young women had and imagined that we had created this fantastically free landscape, and instead it turns out that what we'd done, okay, was simply symptomatic of our own generation, which had been produced by these really realistic parents who had suffered the Depression or World War II and so on and so forth. And we have left a chaos, actually, okay, for young women. We said, yes, you know, there's no need to be a virgin until you're married, you can do your own thing, etc. But you know, these young women are trying to find their way, and this is why they want the rules. That's why they want the universities to act as foster parents to them.
But why isn't it empowering for women to be able to say, yes, I want to have sex with you?
Because
it's not that I'm frail, it's that I have the power to say yes to what I want, and that's what
sex is a physical transaction, okay? There's a part of the brain that is verbal, and there's a part of the brain, there's also the limbic part of the brain, which is emotional, okay? And there's all kinds of chaos going on in the emotional realm. This is why I feel that young women are stumbling into this, is because they have not been taught about the complexities of the human psychology. They haven't been exposed to great literature which shows all kinds of brutality and animal violence can erupt, okay, from the unconscious. Okay? So the Freudian perspective is completely gone in this new kind of a social work way of viewing sexuality. It's madness, and I think the future will laugh. The future will laugh at the absurdities, okay, of this system.
But speaking of the future, do you think, though, and I'm thinking now of the 60s, some of the things that happened in the 60s, whether this is an extremism that is part of a historical evolution? In other words, the pendulum has to swing sometimes too far. You get too much legislation, you get too much stridency, or whatever you want to call it, and then things regularize. And that we're at this point with many issues, particularly with race, but also with sexual harassment and so forth, things that we just had buried or not seen before that have come to the surface, and then the effort to deal with them is very extreme, perhaps too extreme, but that's part of the evolutionary process.
I don't think it's too extreme to say rapists shouldn't rape. I think that we have a new generation.
I'm not talking about rape. What about sexual harassment? What about language that is said to be uncomfortable?
Okay, uncomfortable, offensive, completely First Amendment protected. That's why my book is about offensive speech, which is legally protected.
It isn't protected, though, on college campuses in many cases, because if people say things.
Because it's a workplace, and it's forbidden under Title VII, and as a student, it's forbidden. These things, these acts that we think of as legally protected speech, and mostly on college campuses, you do actually have all the federal protections of the First Amendment if you take federal money. So there's a series of hate speech cases, RAV, UMW, that say that if a school takes public money, they must guarantee free speech rights. So
what about these people that have not been allowed to speak on campuses?
Right. There's not a diminished speech right on campus. There's more conversation. And so it may seem extreme, but I think we fostered a race, gender, LGBTQ equality movement, and the movement is saying these things are part of our oppression, these things are part of our perpetuated inequality, and we've worked on the systemic things. We did these lawsuits over money, and we can now sit at the counter, and we have kind of equal voting rights. But now we're going to talk about equality everywhere we go, because we're human.
And these are the microaggressions.
That's one example of them, for sure. But if we're saying that we demand equality in the home, in the workplace, in the school, why not in the public square?
I'm going to begin to end this wonderful conversation, very complex, by asking you each what you would like to see as social critics, advocates for social justice. What would you like to see on the university campus, or in the university curriculum, or in general in education in the next decade or so?
Well, that's a fantastic question. I think it's really important for all students who are going to go out and live in our, heterogeneous, multiracial society, to have a class that talks about these issues. We have to talk about who we are in our local environment of the university, in our cities. What does it mean? What's our responsibility as students, professors, et cetera, in our cities, in our states, in our national community and discourse, and as global citizens. And so these issues are not going to go away as we become more heterogeneous, more globalized. There are going to continue to be struggles over civil rights on all kinds of levels. We need to be having these tough conversations, and we need to, as educators, do everything that we can to promote everyone being able to participate in those conversations.
Camille.
Well, I would like to see a radical restructuring of the liberal arts universities to eliminate perhaps 60% of the meaningless electives, and to construct a core curriculum that has a world multicultural basis, but also follows history chronologically from ancient to modern. And then secondly, okay, I want a radical severance, okay, of bureaucratic intrusion and powers into the lives of the social lives of the students. And I'm going to be trying to encourage the students themselves to rebel, okay, and to say, get out of our private lives, okay, because right now the movement is in the opposite direction, more and more controls by the substitute parent figures of the administration.
Well, that's a wonderful place to end. And I want to thank you both,
Thanks for
Laura Beth
having us.
Nielsen, Camille Paglia, for being here today. And thank you for joining us today at the Drexel Interview.